spoke, and I say fuck a lot. But I accept myself for the way I am. I accept you too. Viewer discretion advised.
Carleton Gajdusek, who performed questionable research in which he never could isolate a virus from Kuru disease, nevertheless became known as the father of the slow virus idea.
The virus hunters still had many weapons to pull from their box of tricks, such as the concept of the slow virus, a virus capable of sleeping in a cell for years before striking with its pathogenic or fatal effects. The claim that a disease takes a very long time, decades, to break out, gained popularity in the 1960s when virus hunters convinced the medical establishment that the virus concept could even be imposed on cancer, that is, a disease that generally appears after years or decades. But despite a most arduous search, researchers were simply unable to find any active viruses in tumours. The disappointment and frustration was correspondingly great, but a new theory was soon developed, that a virus could provoke an infection, then lie dormant in a cell for as long as it wanted, and finally at some point trigger cancer, even when the virus is no longer present. Just as with polio earlier, the genome of a so-called slow virus had never been isolated, and the particles claimed to be slow viruses have never been imaged with an electron microscope, but the virus hunters embraced the suspect theory and adapted it to a number of modern ailments.
I've already made a couple of videos about this before. Carleton Gajdusek, the lunatic pedophile, who, like most government scientists today, cling to their hypothesis and force all data to fit it in one way or another. He's a guy that came up with the slow virus theory, or unconventional virus. And without that, they can never have blamed AIDS on HIV. I'll leave links to my videos below, along with links to all other sources that I use in this video.
Australian scientist Professor Michael Alpers has dedicated over 50 years researching Kuru, an incurable brain disease unique to Papua New Guinea.
The first reports about Kuru in the general literature came from anthropologists describing Kuru as a psychosomatic disease. Some kind of reaction to the change in their world with the advent of the Australian administration. I found it exotic.
After 3 months in the field, he was no closer to solving the puzzle that was Kuru. Then he met American virologist Carleton Gajdusek, the only other medical researcher dedicated to trying to understand this strange disease.
Everything was perfect. He was the right person in the right place, the right time. It's just he was extraordinarily fortunate that that should have happened to him.
Although he had no permission, resources or equipment, Carleton cancelled his return flight to the US. He set up a small lab in the jungle and started to dissect the victims of the disease on his kitchen table.
It didn't take very long to realize that we were both on the same wavelength in terms of our attitude to the world and where we thought what we were doing would fit in.
Before making it to the South Foray tribe to study Kuru, Carleton stopped off to stay with the Kuka tribe.
Carleton writes in his diary about how he loved the smell of the Kuka male adolescents, the smell of grease, pig fat, wood fires and semen. Now, whether he actively participated in any of these practices is another matter.
I have never once taken a kid to my bed. They have come to my bed, and I am no one to kick them out. If they hug me and I find them playing with my cock, I say, good on you, I play with theirs. And I'll do it now and with great pleasure.
Did you just fantasize about his participation? But they clearly fascinated him.
Gajdusek's fascination had deep roots. For years he had recorded in his journal his anguish over his attraction to young boys.
With 300 or 400 boys who had sex with me from 8 and 10 and 12, 100% have run into my bed, jumped in without my mentioning it, and asked for sex.
Carleton had done every medical test known to science, in particular investigating the prime suspect, cannibalism.
Everybody's been thinking cannibalism, everybody I met, before I saw Kuru. But we found that that couldn't be the case. We had no inflammation, all the medical reasons for not. and we threw it out.
Cannibalism had to be dismissed when every one of Carleton's tests on animals demonstrated that kuru was neither infectious nor transmissible.
We inoculated everything from snakes to bears. And we had watched them for 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 months. 0. This was something new. I didn't know anything about what it was, but it was certainly new.
No human disease had ever taken more than a few weeks for infection to surface. And more significantly, no degenerative brain disease had ever been shown to be transmissible between humans.
And if we were able to show that kuru was transmissible, this would open up a new field in human medicine. There was no question about that. People would have to take notice.
But first, Michael and Carleton had to embark on something no scientist had ever attempted.
This meant that we had to do transmission experiments with the expectation of incredibly long incubation periods.
Michael then set about finding a suitable patient for the autopsy.
I knew Kigea as a young girl in the village. The rumour was that she had kuru, so I went to see her, and she would have been a little bit unsteady on her feet. In this context, here, where kuru is the dominant disease, you know what the outcome is. Even an 11-year-old will know that she's got this disease and she's going to die.
Michael meets with Kigea's family to seek permission to perform the autopsy. The family agrees, and over the next 6 months, Michael observes and records the deterioration of Kigea as kuru begins to take its course.
So she was a wonderful young girl. I'll never forget her.
A call goes out from the small hamlet. Kigea has finally died. Within half an hour, Michael arrives at the house.
There was grieving, shouting, wailing, and all the wailing and crying sort of didn't help really in professional activity of doing a good autopsy, but I shut that out. I couldn't look at Kigea's features. She was a head. I had to get the skull off, had to get the brain out, and we had to go quickly. And we did that. There was no turning back.
Michael leaves the foray for Washington, D.C., where Carleton has organized a facility for the transmission experiment. Here, the samples of kuru are injected into the brains of 2 chimpanzees, Daisy and Georgette.
A close look at Gajdussek's trials on apes, with which he aimed to show transmissibility, should have shocked the scientific community into disbelief. But instead, they recognised these papers as proof of transmissibility and ignored the fact that neither feeding the apes brain mush nor injecting them with it had any effect on the chimpanzees. So Gajdusek conducted a bizarre experiment in order to finally induce neural symptoms in the test animals. He ground up the brain of a kuru patient into a mush full of proteins, along with a number of other substances, and poured this into the living apes by drilling holes into their skulls. This so-called disease's alleged transmissibility was founded only upon these experiments. How could it possibly derive proof of Gajdusek's cannibalistic hypothesis? Particularly since the hypothesis proposes that the disease could appear in humans through ingestion of infected brains and not through direct surgical insertion into the brain.
2 years after being injected with infected brain tissue, the chimpanzees developed kuru. The significance of this outcome couldn't be overstated. They had discovered a totally new type of human disease. It was the first time a human degenerative brain disease had been shown to be transmissible. And what's more, it had the longest incubation period of any human disease known to science.
These are very exciting times. I mean, intellectually very exciting, we'd achieved a lot, and it was clear that this probably meant a Nobel Prize.
Carleton's team discovered that the particle causing the disease was 1,000 times smaller than any other known infecting agent, and found only in the brain and spinal cord. But exactly how it caused the infection was still a complete mystery.
But I couldn't find an antibody, and we still can't. So everything about it is unique. The rule is still today that every infection on Earth produces antibodies. No exception on Earth. No AIDS patient on Earth. Catch on? That's the important rule. So I called it an unconventional virus.
And in 1976, Carleton finally won the Nobel Prize for his discovery of what he called an unconventional virus. But he wasn't the only one hungry for a Nobel Prize.
I didn't think these particles were viruses. I didn't think they were slow viruses. I didn't think they were unconventional viruses. I thought they were different.
Bullshit. It's a virus.
However, biochemist Stanley Prusner disagreed and gave Carleton's virus a name, identifying it as a protein particle he called a prion, starting one of the most bitter rivalries in science.
Stan says, it's not a virus, it's a prion. That's not a discovery, that's a word.
Well, that's the one thing I agree with him on. When someone can't, quote, discover something, they just make up a new word or change a definition.
Prusner would have to wait another 20 years to win his Nobel Prize, his findings turning the world of science upside down. Prions ignore the rules of normal biological reproduction. They recruit rather than reproduce, targeting normal proteins and converting them into replicates of themselves. These in turn attack and convert more, building ever-increasing numbers that kill cells in the brain.
So now we had an entirely new disease paradigm that evolved out of these basic studies and the discovery of the prion protein.
If it wasn't a, quote, virus or a, quote, prion, what could it have been?
Virologist Carleton Gajdusek of the American National Institutes of Health, who reported finding evidence of the first slow virus in humans. A slow virus is a virus alleged to produce a disease long after the original infection, that is, after a long latent period. He believed it to be the cause of Kuru disease among New Guinea natives. Kuru was a slowly progressing neurological disease that led to the debilitation of motor skills. The patients presented with symptoms of tremor and paralysis similar to Parkinson's disease.
Gajdusek had spotted similarities between Kuru and the better-known afflictions Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease.
Well, they were spraying DDT over Papua New Guinea, and probably other chemicals too. From the Gerald Dury Herald and Urana Advertiser. I don't know if I said that right. Thursday, June 3, 1948. Fighting the winged scourge. Anti-malarial precautions against mosquitoes adopted by the Australian Army during the war were based on spray tests conducted by the CSIR, Council of Scientific and Industrial Research, and described now for the first time in a newly released bulletin, 219. Killing power of sprays was found to depend on the amount of pyrethrins atomized rather than the volume of spray used. Insecticides tested include oils of several native plants and the widely publicized DDT. Field trials in New Guinea supplemented the laboratory tests. Wild female malaria-transmitting mosquitoes were subjected to the most promising sprays in tents and airy huts. A straight pyrethrin and a pyrethrin plus DDT spray were finally selected for Army use, both sprays killing all mosquitoes in sprayed habitations. And then from The Age, Friday, October 28, 1955, suggestion for DDT dusting. In New Guinea, the Army showed during the war how to clear an area of mosquitoes. Low-flying aircraft gave a thorough dusting with DDT powder every week, and except for occasional ones, the pests disappeared. Why can't swampy areas around the parts of Melbourne and other Victorian towns be treated with a similar way by the aircraft which do crop dusting? So they were testing there. But that's not all I found. From Gajdusek's Nobel Prize biography. While at Caltech and while with John Enders on postgraduate work at Harvard. That's a whole nother story, but some of you might be familiar with John Enders. I have never abandoned my clinical interest, particularly in pediatrics and neurology, which were nurtured by a group of inspiring bedside teachers. And one of the teachers, Dr. Richard Day at Babies Hospital, Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center in New York. I've made videos about Dr. Richard Day before. I'll leave links to those below as well, but he was the insider and speaker from the New Order of Barbarians, the doctor from 1969 that gave lectures about how the future of medicine was going to be and ushering us into a new world order. Not only that, but I found connections between Dr. Richard Day and Operation Paperclip, because he brought Albert Speer's daughter, Hilda Speer, to the U.S. in the 50s. Adolf Hitler's architect, Albert Speer, who was sentenced in Nuremberg to prison for 20 years, well, his daughter, Hilda Speer, came to the U.S. in the 50s, and guess who she lived with? Dr. Day. McLean's The Waiting Whites of Spandau, March 15, 1954. Jack Fishman. Margaret Speer changed the subject once more. It was about her daughter, 17-year-old Hilda. She wanted to talk. Last summer, Hilda changed her home in Heidelberg for another in Hastings-on-Hudson, New York. She was chosen by the American Board of Re-Education of the U.S. Information Services in Germany as one of a number of pupils to spend 12 months at an American school learning the democratic way of life. The identity of her father was an official secret, and she lived with a Dr. Richard Day, a children's doctor and psychologist. Hilda shares the Day family's home life, attends the local school with Day's 3 daughters, and is a regular speaker at international youth discussion groups. The only people in the locality aware of her background are Day and his wife. Another thing they had in common, 1948, the UN sent Gajdusek to Germany, and he came home with a little German boy who he had his mother adopt.
In 1948, the UN sent Gajdusek on a mission to Germany. Carleton grew close to a German family and offered to take the son to the US to be educated and see the world. He persuaded his mother to adopt the boy. It was to be the start of a life devoted to adopted kids.
It was a surprise, for me to be selected by Carleton, that to come over to the States to have an opportunity, and I trusted him implicitly. He would take care of me.
And I thought it was kind of odd that Dr. Day brought Hilda Speer to the U.S. in the 50s, and she went on to become a prominent politician in Germany, now known as Hilda Schramm. But the little boy that Gajdusek had his mother adopt in Germany, Wolfgang Kleber, went on to become senior director of the U.S. defense industry. It seems to me they both were involved with Paperclip, but that's my opinion. But anyway, we can thank this lunatic pedophile, Carleton Gajdusek, for the slow virus theory, which led everybody to think HIV caused AIDS.
There is what I consider a normal family. He pushes and pushes to help mother please, and when that happens, you have endearing families for life. If you want tender care from your children, if you want them to wipe your ass when you're 90 and you're demented, if you want them to stick around when you're sick, instead of putting you in an old age, almost everybody here does and never visits them. If you want the family to stick together, you have to have intergenerational sex. Intergenerational. And it has to be within the family.
This is where we don't think the same, Carleton. I don't believe this.
Well, I think it's that. I think the whole problem of the whole world is the lack of it. And I consider it a defective upbringing if you haven't helped your parents have fun in sex.
Fucking stoned.